After inheriting a building from my late husband, my daughter-in-law snapped, "You're greedy. We're cutting ties." One tenant hadn't paid rent in 8 years, and when I went to evict him, he said, "Check your husband's wallet." I looked, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought the worst day of my life would come 3 weeks after I buried my husband. Standing in the lawyer's office on that cold Tuesday morning in March, I clutched the deed to Mitchell's apartment building with trembling hands. The ink was still drying on the inheritance papers when my daughter-in-law Jovi burst through the door like a hurricane, her face twisted with an anger I'd never seen before. "This is disgusting, Loretta," she spat, her voice cutting through the quiet office like broken glass. Absolutely disgusting. I looked up from the papers, confused and still raw from grief. "Jovi, what are you talking about?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Don't play innocent with me. You manipulated Mitchell into leaving you everything. That building should have gone to David. He's his son." The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I could see he wanted to disappear into the mahogany paneling behind his desk. This wasn't the first family dispute he'd witnessed over an inheritance, but the venom in Jovi's voice made the air feel poisonous. "Jovi, please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mitchell made his own decisions. I never asked him for anything." "Bullshit!" The word hit me like a slap. In the 22 years she'd been married to my son David, I'd never heard Jovi use language like that. "You've been poisoning him against us for years, making him think we only wanted his money." My chest tightened. "That's not true. I loved Mitchell. I would never—" "You're nothing but a greedy old woman," she continued, her eyes blazing. "Well, congratulations. You got what you wanted, but don't expect us to stick around and watch you count your coins." She turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at me with such contempt that I actually flinched. "We're done, Loretta. David and I are cutting all ties with you. Don't call us. Don't visit. Don't even think about us." The door slammed behind her with such force that the diplomas on Mr. Henderson's wall rattled. I sat there in the deafening silence, staring at the spot where she'd been standing, trying to process what had just happened. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mr. Henderson said gently, "perhaps we should continue this another time." I nodded numbly, gathering the papers with shaking hands. Outside, the March wind cut through my coat as I walked to my car. The building keys felt heavy in my purse, like they were made of lead instead of brass. The drive home was a blur of tears and disbelief. How had I gone from grieving widow to family outcast in the span of 20 minutes? Jovi's words echoed in my head. Greedy old woman. Was that really how she saw me? How they all saw me? At home, I sat at my kitchen table and spread out the inheritance papers. The Riverside Apartments, 12 units, built in 1967, current market value estimated at $450,000. It wasn't a fortune, but for someone living on Social Security and a small pension, it represented security. A way to pay for medications, home repairs, maybe even help David and Jovi with their mortgage. But apparently, my generosity was seen as greed. 2 days later, I finally worked up the courage to visit the property Mitchell had left me. The Riverside Apartments sat on Oak Street, a 4-story brick building that had seen better days. The paint was peeling around the windows, and weeds pushed through cracks in the sidewalk. It wasn't the worst building in the neighborhood, but it wasn't the best either. I let myself into the small office on the ground floor, breathing in the musty smell of old carpet and decades of cigarette smoke. File cabinets lined one wall, stuffed with what looked like years of paperwork. A desk sat in the corner, covered with a thick layer of dust. It took me 3 hours to find the rent records, buried in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet that stuck so badly I had to use a butter knife to pry it open. What I found made my blood run cold. Apartment 4B, tenant, Malcolm Peterson. Monthly rent, $800. Last payment received, March 2016. I counted on my fingers, then counted again. 8 years. 8 years without a single rent payment. That was over $76,000 in lost income. My hands trembled as I flipped through more records. Every other tenant paid regularly. Some were late occasionally, but they all paid. Except Malcolm Peterson. I found his original lease agreement at the bottom of the stack. The signature was definitely Mitchell's, but something about it looked strange. The ink was darker, newer, like it had been signed recently, not 8 years ago. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Why would Mitchell let someone live rent-free for 8 years? It didn't make sense. My husband was generous, but he was also practical. He wouldn't just give away nearly $80,000 without a good reason. The building's financial records painted a grim picture. What should have been a profitable investment was barely breaking even. The missing rent from 4B explained why Mitchell had been dipping into our savings to cover building expenses, why we'd had to tighten our budget over the past few years, why he'd seemed stressed about money but never wanted to discuss it. The next morning, I drove back to the building with a heavy heart and a manila folder full of eviction notices I'd printed from the internet. I'd never evicted anyone before, but I couldn't afford to keep hemorrhaging money. At 66, every dollar mattered. Apartment 4B was on the top floor. I climbed the narrow stairs slowly, my knees protesting with each step. The hallway smelled like cooking oil and pine cleaner. Numbers hung crooked on most of the doors, and the carpet was worn thin in the middle from decades of foot traffic. I stood outside 4B for a full minute before knocking, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The door had been painted so many times that the wood grain was completely obscured, and someone had scratched initials into the frame, MP plus ER forever. When the door finally opened, I found myself face to face with a man who looked to be in his early 40s. He was tall and thin, with prematurely gray hair and eyes the same unusual shade of green as my late husband's. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans with holes in the knees. "You must be Loretta," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I've been expecting you." Something about his tone caught me off guard. He wasn't defensive or angry like I'd expected. Instead, he seemed almost relieved. I clutched my folder tighter. "Mr. Peterson, I'm here about your rent. You haven't paid in 8 years." He stepped back, gesturing for me to come inside. "Please, call me Malcolm. And yes, I know about the rent." The apartment was not what I expected. Instead of the mess I'd imagined, it was clean and homey. Family photos covered every surface, and the furniture, while old, was well maintained. What struck me most was how lived in it felt. This wasn't the apartment of someone taking advantage of a free ride. This was someone's home. "Can I get you some coffee?" Malcolm asked, moving toward a small kitchenette. "No, thank you." I remained standing near the door, unsure whether I should stay or go. "Mr. Peterson, Malcolm, I need to know why you haven't been paying rent." He poured himself a cup of coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing for hours. When he turned back to me, his eyes were sad in a way that reminded me of someone, though I couldn't place who. "Your husband never told you about me, did he?" Something in his tone made my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Malcolm walked to a bookshelf and picked up a framed photograph. He handed it to me without a word. The photo showed a much younger Malcolm, maybe in his 20s, standing next to a woman with dark hair and a bright smile. She was holding a baby, and they all looked happy. But what made my breath catch was the man standing behind them with his hand on Malcolm's shoulder. It was Mitchell, but not the Mitchell I knew. This Mitchell looked younger, happier somehow, and he was wearing a wedding ring I'd never seen before. "I think," Malcolm said quietly, "there are some things about your husband you need to know." I stared at the photograph until my eyes burned, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The woman in the picture had kind eyes and wore a simple white dress. The baby couldn't have been more than 6 months old, but it was Mitchell's presence in the photo that shattered something inside me. "When was this taken?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Malcolm took the frame from my trembling hands and set it back on the shelf. 1982. That's my mother, Elena Rodriguez. And that's me as a baby. 1982. Mitchell and I had been married for 3 years by then. We were trying to have children, going to fertility doctors, spending money we didn't have on treatments that never worked. all while he was. I don't understand, I said, though part of me was beginning to understand all too well. Malcolm gestured toward his small couch. Please, sit down. This is going to be difficult to hear. I perched on the edge of the cushion, clutching my purse so tightly my knuckles went white. Malcolm sat across from me in a worn armchair, his hands clasped in front of him like he was praying. My mother worked as a waitress at Mel's Diner on 5th Street. That's where she met your husband. He used to come in every Tuesday and Thursday for lunch, always ordered the same thing, meatloaf and mashed potatoes. I knew that detail was true. Mitchell had eaten lunch at Mel's for as long as I'd known him. It was close to the insurance office where he worked. But the thought of him sitting in that red vinyl booth, flirting with another woman while I was at home planning our future family, made me feel sick. They started talking, Malcolm continued. My mother said he was lonely, said his wife, you, worked a lot, and you two were having problems. The words hit me like a physical blow. Problems. We hadn't been having problems. We'd been struggling with infertility, yes, but I thought we were handling it together. I'd been working extra shifts at the hospital to pay for the fertility treatments. I thought I was helping. My mother fell in love with him, Malcolm said softly. And he told her he loved her too. Said he was going to leave his wife and marry her. But he didn't, I said, my voice hollow. No, he didn't. Malcolm stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. When my mother told him she was pregnant, everything changed. Suddenly he couldn't leave his wife because it would be too complicated, too expensive, too messy. I felt sick. All those nights I'd cried myself to sleep, wondering why God wouldn't give us a child. All those hormone shots and doctor visits and failed attempts. Meanwhile, Mitchell had gotten another woman pregnant and then abandoned her. What happened to your mother? She raised me alone until I was 5. Mitchell would visit sometimes, bring money, toys. He told me to call him Uncle Mitch. Malcolm's voice grew bitter. Uncle Mitch, who looked exactly like me. Uncle Mitch, who my mother cried about when she thought I was asleep. The room felt like it was spinning. I gripped the arm of the couch, trying to steady myself. Where is she now? She died when I was 8, cancer. Malcolm turned back to me and I could see tears in his eyes. Your husband paid for the funeral, told everyone he was a family friend. After that, I went into foster care. Oh God, I breathed. Malcolm, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I know you didn't. He returned to his chair, leaning forward. When I aged out of the system at 18, I tracked him down. I wasn't looking for money or revenge. I just wanted to know my father. Father. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. All those years I'd grieved our inability to have children, all those treatments, all that heartbreak. And Mitchell had a son. Had always had a son. What did he say when you found him? Malcolm let out a bitter laugh. He panicked. Told me that acknowledging me would destroy his marriage, destroy his life, but he felt guilty enough to offer me this apartment. Said I could live here as long as I needed to, no questions asked. That was 8 years ago? Yes. I'd been working construction, barely making ends meet. This place gave me stability. I was able to go back to school, get my electrician's license. I kept thinking maybe someday he'd be ready to tell you the truth, to let me be part of the family. I thought about all the times Mitchell had mentioned problems with the building, how he'd handled all the maintenance himself, how he'd insisted I didn't need to worry about business details, how he'd made excuse after excuse for why the building wasn't making much profit. He never intended to tell me, did he? Malcolm shook his head. I don't think so. When he got sick last year, I hoped maybe facing his mortality would change his mind. But even in the hospital, he made me promise to stay away from the funeral. Said it would be better for everyone if you never knew. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. The street below looked the same as it had an hour ago, but my entire world had shifted. My marriage had been built on lies. My husband had abandoned his own child, and I'd spent 43 years loving a man who was capable of such cruelty. And Jovi? Does she know? Malcolm was quiet for so long I turned around to look at him. His face had gone pale. Malcolm? I think, he said slowly, you should look in your husband's wallet. What? His wallet, the one they gave you with his personal effects from the hospital. Look in the hidden compartment behind his driver's license. My mouth went dry. How do you know about that? Because 3 days before he died, your daughter-in-law came to see me. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Jovi was here? She knew Loretta. She's known about me for years. I sank back onto the couch, the room spinning around me. That's impossible. How could she know? Malcolm walked to a small desk in the corner and pulled out a manila envelope. Because she's the one who's been collecting the rent money. He handed me bank statements, deposit slips, and copies of money orders, all made out to Jovi Barrett. $800 every month for 8 years. My hands shook as I looked through the papers. $76,800. Nearly $77,000 that should have been mine, that should have helped pay for Mitchell's medical bills, that should have secured my future. I don't understand, I whispered, though the pieces were starting to fall into place in a way that made me want to vomit. She told me that Mitchell was too sick to handle the building anymore, that she was managing the finances for the family. She said you knew about the arrangement and approved it. Malcolm's voice was full of regret. I should have questioned it, but she was family. I trusted her. Nearly $80,000. Jovi had been collecting my inheritance for 8 years and I'd never known. No wonder she was so angry about me inheriting the building. No wonder she'd accused me of being greedy. She played us both, I said, the realization hitting me like a freight train. Looks that way. Malcolm sat down heavily. I'm sorry, Loretta. I never meant for any of this to hurt you. I looked at this man, this stranger who was my husband's son, who had been living in my building, paying rent to my daughter-in-law while I struggled to pay my own bills, who looked so much like Mitchell it made my chest ache. What else did she tell you? Malcolm hesitated. She said that after Mitchell died, you'd probably try to evict me, that you were the type of person who only cared about money, not people. She said I should be prepared to fight for my home. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Jovi had been setting me up to be the villain from the start, making sure Malcolm would see me as the enemy while she collected the money that should have been mine. But there was something else. Something in Malcolm's expression that told me he was holding back. There's more, isn't there? I asked. Malcolm nodded slowly. She brought someone with her when she came to collect the rent last month. A real estate appraiser. They measured the apartment, took photos, asked about the building's condition. My blood turned to ice. She's planning to sell. That's what I think. And if she's been forging documents, if she's been collecting rent under false pretenses. Malcolm trailed off, but I understood. If Jovi had the building appraised, if she had 8 years of false rent records, she might be planning something much bigger than just cutting me out of the family. She might be planning to steal my inheritance entirely. But first, I needed to see what was hidden in Mitchell's wallet. The drive home from Malcolm's apartment felt like driving through a fog. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but I barely registered the familiar streets passing by. All I could think about was Mitchell's wallet, sitting in the bedroom dresser where I'd placed it 3 weeks ago, unable to bring myself to go through his things. At home, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the brown leather wallet that had lived in Mitchell's back pocket for as long as I could remember. It smelled like his cologne and the peppermints he always carried. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Driver's license, credit cards, a $20 bill and some receipts from the pharmacy. Everything looked normal, ordinary, but Malcolm had specifically mentioned a hidden compartment behind the license. I slid the plastic card out of its slot and felt around behind it. Nothing. Then, I pressed harder, and my fingertip caught on something. A small flap of leather, so thin and well-concealed I would have missed it entirely if I hadn't been looking for it. Inside was a single photograph, folded in half. I unfolded it with shaking hands, and my world collapsed. It was the same woman from Malcolm's photo, Elena Rodriguez, but this picture was different, more intimate. She was lying in what looked like a hospital bed, holding a newborn baby. She looked exhausted but radiant, the way new mothers do. And sitting beside her, holding her hand, was Mitchell. But it wasn't just Mitchell visiting a friend. The way he was looking at her, the tenderness in his expression, the protective way his body was angled toward them both. This was a man looking at his family. On the back, in Elena's handwriting, Malcolm James Peterson, born March 15th, 1982. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. He has your eyes. Malcolm James. He'd named his son after his father. I turned the photo over again, studying every detail. The hospital bracelet on Elena's wrist, the tiny hand visible outside the blanket. Mitchell's wedding ring, clearly visible as he reached toward the baby. My wedding ring. The one I'd placed on his finger on our wedding day in 1979. The betrayal cut so deep I couldn't breathe. While I was working double shifts to pay for fertility treatments, crying every month when my period came, begging God for a child, Mitchell had been with another woman, had created the family I so desperately wanted. But there was something else tucked behind the photo, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a birth certificate. Malcolm James Peterson. Father, Mitchell James Hartwell. Mother, Elena Rodriguez. My husband's name was spelled differently, but it was definitely him. He'd legally acknowledged paternity. This wasn't just an affair or a mistake. This was a choice. I sank onto the bed, the documents scattered around me. 41 years. For 41 years, Mitchell had kept this secret, had let me believe I was barren, that we were unlucky, that God had simply chosen not to bless us with children, all while his son grew up without him. My phone rang, startling me out of my spiral. David's name flashed on the screen. My son, who didn't know he had a half-brother, who'd cut me out of his life 3 days ago at his wife's urging. "David?" I answered, my voice hoarse. "Mom." He sounded tired, strained. "We need to talk. I tried calling you yesterday. Jovi said you never wanted to see me again." There was a long pause. "Jovi says a lot of things. Can you come over? Tonight?" Something in his tone worried me. "Are you all right? Just, please, come over. And Mom, don't tell Jovi I called." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, then at the birth certificate in my lap. Everything was unraveling so fast I couldn't keep up. 2 hours later, I stood on David and Jovi's front porch, the envelope containing Malcolm's birth certificate clutched in my hand. The house was dark except for a single light in the kitchen window. David answered the door before I could knock. His face was drawn, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Where's Jovi?" I asked. "Book club. She won't be back for 2 hours." He stepped aside to let me in. "Mom, I'm sorry about what happened at the lawyer's office. Jovi was upset, and she was collecting rent from your father's building," I said quietly. "For 8 years. David froze halfway to the kitchen. "What are you talking about?" I followed him into the room where I'd shared countless family dinners, where Jovi had always insisted on sitting at the head of the table. "There's a tenant who hasn't paid rent since 2016. Except he has been paying. To Jovi. That's impossible." But David's voice lacked conviction. $76,800, David. That's how much she's stolen from me." He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "Jesus, Mom. I had no idea. There's more." I set the envelope on the table between us. "Your father had another son." David's head snapped up. "What?" "His name is Malcolm Peterson. He's 41 years old, and he's been living in apartment 4B. I slid the birth certificate across the table. "He's the tenant Jovi's been collecting rent from." David picked up the document, his face going pale as he read. "This can't be real." "It is. I found it hidden in your father's wallet, along with a photo of Malcolm as a newborn. Dad had an affair?" "More than that. He abandoned his son when Malcolm was 5. Left him and his mother because acknowledging them would have been too complicated." David set the certificate down with shaking hands. "Mom, I don't know what to say. Did you know about Jovi collecting the rent?" "No." His answer was immediate, but then he hesitated. "Although, there were some things that didn't add up." "What kind of things?" "She always had extra money. Said she was doing freelance bookkeeping, but she never seemed to have clients. And she was always pushing Dad to update his will, asking questions about the building's value." I felt sick. How long has this been going on? The questions about Dad's will? Years? She said it was important for estate planning, making sure everything went to the right people. David looked up at me, realization dawning in his eyes. She never meant for it to go to you, did she? I don't think so. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of betrayal settling between us. Finally, David spoke. There's something else you need to know, Mom. Something I should have told you years ago. My stomach clenched. What? Jovi's been talking to a lawyer about having Dad declared incompetent in his final months. She wanted to challenge any will that didn't leave everything to me. The room spun around me. When? She started talking about it right after Dad's diagnosis. Said he wasn't thinking clearly, that you were taking advantage of him. David's voice cracked. I told her to stop, that it wasn't right. But she said she was protecting our family. From me. She made it sound like you were the threat. Like you were manipulating a sick old man. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. God, Mom. What if she's been planning this all along? What if the rent money was just the beginning? Before I could answer, we heard the sound of a car in the driveway. David's face went white. She's early, he whispered. The front door opened and Jovi's voice rang out cheerfully. David? I'm home. Book club was canceled because Sarah's sick. Her heels clicked across the hardwood floor, getting closer to the kitchen. David quickly swept the birth certificate off the table and handed it to me. Hide that, he whispered urgently. I stuffed it back into the envelope just as Jovi appeared in the doorway. Her smile faltered when she saw me. Loretta, what are you doing here? I invited her, David said. We were talking about Dad. Jovi's eyes narrowed, flicking between us. Talking about what, specifically? About how much I miss him, I said, my voice steady despite the fury building inside me. And about the building he left me. Oh, Jovi's tone was carefully neutral. Having trouble with the tenants? Just one, in apartment 4B. For a split second, something flickered across Jovi's face. Fear, maybe, or calculation. Then her practiced smile returned. Well, I hope you get it sorted out. Some people just take advantage of kindness, don't they? She was standing right in front of me. This woman who had stolen nearly $80,000 from me, who had turned my son against me, who had been planning to steal my inheritance, and she was talking about people taking advantage of kindness. Yes, I said quietly. Some people do. But as I looked at her perfect smile and carefully styled hair, I realized that Jovi had no idea I knew about Malcolm. She thought she was still in control, still pulling the strings. She had no idea that everything was about to change. The next morning, I called Malcolm and asked him to meet me at a coffee shop downtown. I needed to see those bank statements again. Needed to understand the full scope of what Jovi had been doing. More importantly, I needed to tell him the truth about what I'd found in Mitchell's wallet. Malcolm was already waiting when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups of coffee. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much either. Thank you for meeting me, I said, sliding into the seat across from him. Of course. He pushed one of the coffee cups toward me. Did you find what you were looking for? I pulled the envelope from my purse and placed it on the table between us. Your birth certificate, and a photo of you as a newborn with your parents. Malcolm's hands stilled on his coffee cup. He kept them? Hidden in his wallet. For 41 years. Malcolm opened the envelope with trembling fingers, staring at the documents I'd found. When he saw the photo, his eyes filled with tears. I never knew this existed, he whispered. My mother always said he wasn't there when I was born. That he was too scared to come to the hospital. He was there, I said softly. He was there, and he acknowledged you legally. Your birth certificate lists him as your father. Then why? Malcolm's voice broke. Why did he abandon us? It was a question I'd been asking myself all night. I think he was a coward. I think he wanted both lives and couldn't handle the guilt when he had to choose. Malcolm nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. What does this mean? For us, I mean. It means you're his legitimate heir. The building, the money Jovi's been stealing, it should be split between you and David. I don't want his money, Malcolm said quickly. That's not why I'm telling you this. I know, but Jovi doesn't know that. I leaned forward. I need to ask you something important. When Jovi came to collect the rent, did she ever ask you to sign anything? Malcolm frowned. Actually, yes. Last month she brought some papers. Said they were updates to the lease agreement. Something about property management changes. My blood ran cold. Do you have copies? I think so. Malcolm pulled out his phone. I took photos of everything before I signed. Jovi said it was just routine paperwork, but something about it felt off. He scrolled through his photos and handed me the phone. The documents were lease amendments, but they weren't routine at all. They transferred all rental authority to Jovi Barrett, effective immediately upon the death of the property owner. They also included a clause giving her power of attorney over all building-related decisions. Malcolm, these papers essentially make Jovi the building's manager with full authority to collect rent and make decisions about tenants. What does that mean? It means she's been setting up a legal framework to control the building even after Mitchell died. If she could prove that the building was being mismanaged, if she could show that you weren't paying rent to me, I trailed off as the full scope of her plan became clear. She could have me evicted, Malcolm finished, and then she'd have an empty apartment to rent to someone else at market rate. Or she could claim the building was losing money due to mismanagement and petition the court to have the inheritance transferred to David as the more responsible heir. Malcolm set his coffee cup down hard. She's been planning this for years. I think you're right. I showed him the bank statements he'd given me the day before. Look at these dates. She started collecting your rent in March 2016. That's the same month Mitchell first went to the doctor about his heart problems. You think she knew he was sick before anyone else? I think she's been positioning herself for this moment since the day she learned about you. I pulled out my phone and opened my photo gallery. I took pictures of some financial documents I found in Mitchell's desk last night. Look at this. The documents showed a pattern of increasing medical expenses and decreasing building income over the past 2 years. But the decreasing income was artificial, created by Jovi's theft of Malcolm's rent money. She was bleeding the building dry while Mitchell was sick, I said, making it look like the property was failing so no one would question why there wasn't much money left when he died. Malcolm studied the papers. And if you tried to evict me for non-payment, it would look like you were being cruel to a tenant who'd been loyal to your husband for years. Exactly. She's been playing a long game, Malcolm, making herself look like the responsible family member while painting me as either greedy or incompetent. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Jovi's manipulations settling between us. Finally, Malcolm spoke. What do we do now? Before I could answer, my phone rang. David's name flashed on the screen. Mom? Where are you? His voice was tense, urgent. Having coffee downtown? Why? Jovi's gone. She left early this morning with a suitcase and a bunch of files from Dad's office. She said she was visiting her sister in Phoenix, but her sister called looking for her an hour ago. My heart started racing. What kind of files? I don't know. Building documents, insurance papers, some legal stuff. Mom, I think she knows that you know. I met Malcolm's eyes across the table. David, I need you to do something for me. Go to your father's office at home and see what's missing. Take pictures of everything that's left. Already did. The building deed is gone. So are all the rental agreements and most of the financial records. She's running, I said, more to Malcolm than to David. Or she's accelerating her timeline, Malcolm said grimly. David, I'm coming over, I said into the phone, and I'm bringing someone you need to meet. The drive to David's house felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Malcolm sat quietly in the passenger seat, looking out the window at the suburban streets where his half-brother lived. Are you ready for this? I asked as we pulled into the driveway. I've been waiting my whole life to meet my family, Malcolm said. Real family. David opened the door before we could knock, his face pale and strained. His eyes widened when he saw Malcolm. Jesus, he breathed. You look just like Dad. You look like him too, Malcolm said softly. Around the eyes. I watched my son and stepson see each other for the first time. These two men who should have grown up together, who should have known each other their whole lives. The resemblance was striking, not just to Mitchell, but to each other. David, I said gently, this is Malcolm Peterson, your half-brother. David stepped back, gesturing for us to come inside. This is so surreal. I know, Malcolm said. I've known about you for years, but I never thought we'd actually meet. We gathered in David's living room, the same room where Jovi had served countless family dinners, where she'd played the perfect wife and daughter-in-law while secretly orchestrating this elaborate scheme. Show him the papers, I said to Malcolm. Malcolm pulled out his phone and showed David the lease amendments Jovi had tricked him into signing. She got me to sign these last month, Malcolm explained. I thought they were routine, but they basically give her control over the building. David studied the documents, his expression growing darker. She's been planning this for years. There's more, I said. I told David about the stolen rent money, about the pattern of financial manipulation, about how Jovi had been systematically weakening the building's finances while positioning herself as the responsible family member. I feel like such an idiot, David said, slumping back in his chair. All those times she talked about protecting our family's interests, about making sure Dad's legacy was preserved. She was talking about stealing from you. She's very good at manipulation, Malcolm said. She had me convinced that you knew about the rent arrangement, that you'd approved it, and she had me convinced that Mom was trying to cut us out of Dad's will, David added. We were quiet for a moment, each of us processing the scope of Jovi's deception. Then David's phone buzzed with a text message. It's from Jovi, he said, reading. She says there's been a family emergency, and she won't be back for a few days. She's buying time, I said. The question is, time for what? Malcolm's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned. I don't recognize this number. Answer it, I said. Put it on speaker. Mr. Peterson? The voice was crisp, professional. This is Amanda Chen from Riverside Property Management. We've been trying to reach you about your lease termination. Malcolm's eyes widened. I'm sorry, what? Your lease at the Riverside Apartments was terminated effective today. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises or we'll begin eviction proceedings. Who authorized this? Malcolm asked. Mrs. Jovi Barrett, the building's authorized property manager. She cited non-payment of rent and violation of lease terms. I grabbed the phone. This is Loretta Hartwell, the building's owner. I did not authorize any lease termination. There was a pause. Ma'am, I have documentation showing that Mrs. Barrett has full authority to manage the property and its tenants. Those documents are fraudulent, I said. I'm the legal owner of the building, and I did not give anyone authority to evict tenants. I'm going to need you to come to our office with proof of ownership, Amanda Chen said. Until this is resolved, the eviction notice stands. The line went dead. We all stared at each other in stunned silence. She's trying to get me out of the building, Malcolm said finally. Before we can prove he's Mitchell's son, David added. Before we can challenge her authority. I felt a cold fury settling in my chest. Jovi thought she was so clever, thought she'd covered all her bases. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect my family. And Malcolm was family. He was Mitchell's son, David's brother, my stepson. Jovi had stolen from him, lied to him, manipulated him for years. But her biggest mistake was thinking I'd let her destroy what was left of our family without a fight. The next morning, I stood in the lobby of Riverside Property Management with Malcolm, David, and a folder full of evidence that would expose Jovi's entire scheme. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The fear and confusion of the past few days had crystallized into something harder, colder, determination. Amanda Chen was a small woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and an expensive suit. She looked between the three of us with barely concealed irritation. Mrs. Hartwell, I appreciate you coming in, but I need to see official documentation that supersedes the property management agreement we have on file. I slid the building deed across her desk, along with Mitchell's death certificate and the will that left me the property. These are the original documents. The management agreement you have is fraudulent. Amanda studied the papers carefully. These appear to be in order, but Mrs. Barrett provided us with power of attorney documents that give her authority to act on behalf of the estate. May I see those documents? David asked. Amanda hesitated, then pulled out a file. The power of attorney was dated 3 days before Mitchell died, when he was heavily sedated in the hospital. Jovi had somehow gotten him to sign papers transferring property management authority to her. This signature was obtained under duress, I said. My husband was dying and heavily medicated. He wasn't competent to sign legal documents. That's a serious accusation, Amanda said. Do you have proof? Malcolm leaned forward. I have proof that Mrs. Barrett has been collecting rent under false pretenses for 8 years. He spread out the bank statements and deposit slips showing payments to Jovi. Amanda's expression grew more serious as she examined them. According to our records, apartment 4B has been delinquent for 8 years, she said slowly. Because Mrs. Barrett was stealing the rent money, David said. She was collecting payments from Mr. Peterson while telling the building owner that he wasn't paying. Amanda looked at Malcolm. You've been paying rent this entire time? Every month for 8 years, $800, directly to Jovi Barrett. She told me she was managing the building for the family. And you have proof of these payments? Malcolm nodded, pulling out more bank statements. Money orders, cashier's checks, bank transfers. All to Jovi Barrett, all for the apartment rent. Amanda's professional composure was starting to crack. This is fraud. Financial fraud on a significant scale. $76,800, I said. That's how much she stole from me over 8 years. But there's more, David said. He pulled out his phone and showed Amanda the photos of the lease amendments Jovi had tricked Malcolm into signing. She got Mr. Peterson to sign these documents giving her management authority, but she misrepresented what they were. Amanda studied the documents, her frown deepening. Mr. Peterson, did you understand that you were signing over management rights to Mrs. Barrett? No, Malcolm said firmly. She told me they were routine lease updates, something about property management changes after Mr. Hartwell's death. I thought I was just updating my contact information. This is fraud and forgery, Amanda said, reaching for her phone. I need to call our legal department immediately. While Amanda made her calls, I turned to Malcolm and David. There's something else we need to do. What? David asked. We need to find Jovi before she disappears completely. David frowned. She said she was visiting her sister in Phoenix. Her sister called yesterday looking for her. She's not in Phoenix. Then where is she? Malcolm cleared his throat. I might know. When she came to collect rent last month, she mentioned something about a cabin her family owns up north. Said it would be a good place to retire someday. Do you know where? Somewhere near Lake Tahoe. She said it was her grandfather's old place, completely off the grid. Amanda finished her phone call and turned back to us. Our legal team wants to press charges. This is criminal fraud, and the amount involved makes it a felony. What about the eviction notice? Malcolm asked. Rescinded immediately. You're the victim here, Mr. Peterson. Mrs. Barrett had no authority to evict you. Oh, I felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by worry. Jovi was smart and calculating. If she was hiding at some remote cabin, she might be planning to disappear entirely. There's something else, I said to Amanda. I think Mrs. Barrett may be planning to sell the building without my knowledge. She had it appraised last month. Amanda's eyes widened. That would be real estate fraud. Do you have proof? Mr. Peterson saw the appraiser, and I found documents in my husband's desk showing unusual interest in the building's market value. We need to put a hold on any property transfers, Amanda said, reaching for her phone again. This is much bigger than rent fraud. 2 hours later, we left the property management office with official documentation rescinding the eviction notice and a promise that the police would be contacted about Jovi's fraud. But I knew that wasn't enough. Jovi was out there somewhere, probably planning her next move. We need to find her, I said as we stood on the sidewalk outside. Mom, maybe we should let the police handle this, David said. The police don't know her like we do, I replied. They don't understand how manipulative she is, how she's been planning this for years. Malcolm pulled out his phone. I have an idea. When Jovi collected rent, she always used the same car service. Said it was more professional than driving her own car. Maybe they have records of where they've taken her. It was a long shot, but it was something. David called the car service and, after some convincing and a small lie about a family emergency, learned that they'd driven Jovi to a bus station downtown yesterday morning. She took a bus, David reported, to Sacramento. Why Sacramento? I wondered aloud. Because that's where the county records office is, Malcolm said grimly. If she's planning to forge property transfer documents, that's where she'd need to file them. The drive to Sacramento took 2 hours. We spent most of it in tense silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we might find. I kept thinking about all the signs I'd missed over the years, all the times Jovi had seemed too interested in Mitchell's business affairs, too eager to manage family finances. The county records office was a sprawling government building in downtown Sacramento. We split up to cover more ground, each taking a different department. I found her in the property records division. Jovi was sitting at a computer terminal, typing intently. She'd cut her hair short and dyed it brown, but I recognized her posture, the way she held her shoulders when she was concentrating. I approached slowly, my heart pounding. She didn't notice me until I was standing right behind her. "Hello, Jovi." She spun around, her face going white when she saw me. On the computer screen behind her was a property transfer form, nearly complete. She'd been in the process of transferring the Riverside apartments from my name to David's, with herself listed as the managing agent. "Loretta," she said, trying to recover her composure. "What are you doing here?" "Stopping you from stealing my property." Jovi's eyes darted around the room, looking for escape routes. "I don't know what you're talking about." $76,800, Jovi. That's how much you stole from me. Malcolm Peterson has been paying you rent for 8 years while you told me he was delinquent. Jovi's carefully constructed mask finally slipped. "You don't understand," she hissed. "That money was rightfully David's. Everything Mitchell owned should have gone to his real son, not some gold-digging widow." His real son? I kept my voice calm, even as fury burned in my chest. "What about Malcolm?" Jovi's eyes narrowed. "What about him? Did you know Malcolm is Mitchell's biological son when you started stealing from him?" For the first time, Jovi looked genuinely shocked. "That's impossible." I pulled out the birth certificate and placed it on the desk beside her computer. Malcolm James Peterson, born March 15, 1982. Father, Mitchell James Hartwell. Jovi stared at the document, her face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. "You didn't know," I realized. "You've been stealing from Mitchell's son for 8 years, and you didn't even know he was family." "It doesn't matter," Jovi said, but her voice lacked conviction. "David is still Mitchell's heir. That building should be his. Half of it is," I said. "The other half belongs to Malcolm." Jovi's composure cracked completely. "This is ridiculous. Some bastard child from an affair doesn't have the same rights as a legitimate son. Actually, under California law he does. Especially since Mitchell acknowledged paternity on the birth certificate." Behind me, I heard footsteps. David and Malcolm had found us. "Jovi?" David's voice was full of hurt and disappointment. "What the hell are you doing?" She turned to him, desperation creeping into her voice. "David, I was protecting our family. Everything I did was for us, for our future. By stealing from my mother? By lying to me for years? Your mother doesn't deserve that building," Jovi spat. "She didn't work for it, didn't sacrifice for it. I'm the one who managed the finances, who dealt with the tenants, who stole from the tenants," Malcolm interrupted. "Who collected my rent money while letting my landlord think I was a deadbeat." Jovi looked at Malcolm with undisguised hatred. "You're nothing. A mistake. You don't belong in this family." "Yes, he does," David said firmly. "He's my brother." Something in Jovi's face shifted, a calculating look I'd seen before when she was planning something. "You can't prove any of this. It's your word against mine." I smiled, pulling out my phone. "Actually, I've been recording this entire conversation, including the part where you admitted to stealing the rent money." Jovi's face went white. Behind us, security guards were approaching, alerted by the commotion we'd caused. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" one of the guards asked. Yes, I said. This woman has been attempting to fraudulently transfer property that doesn't belong to her. As the guards detained Jovi, she looked at me with pure venom. You think you've won, but you haven't. This family will never be the same. You're right, I said quietly. It'll be better. Because for the first time in 41 years, our family was finally going to be whole. 6 months later, I stood in the newly renovated lobby of the Riverside Apartments, watching Malcolm install the last of the new light fixtures. His electrician's license had come in handy during the building's transformation. David was painting the trim around the mailboxes, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The legal proceedings against Jovi had moved swiftly once the evidence mounted. The fraud charges were substantial: criminal theft, forgery, attempted real estate fraud. She'd pled guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence, but she was still facing 3 years in prison and full restitution of the $76,800 she'd stolen. Hand me that screwdriver, Malcolm called down from the ladder. I passed it up to him, marveling at how natural this felt. Working together, the three of us rebuilding something that had been broken for so long. How's it looking up there? David asked, setting down his paintbrush. Almost finished, Malcolm replied. These new fixtures are going to make a huge difference. The building's transformation had been remarkable. With the stolen rent money recovered and both David and Malcolm contributing their skills, we'd been able to renovate the common areas, update the plumbing, and make repairs that had been deferred for years. More importantly, the building was finally profitable again. We'd also made another significant change. After consulting with lawyers and reviewing Mitchell's will, we'd restructured the inheritance. Malcolm, as Mitchell's biological son, was entitled to half of everything. David would inherit the other half when I passed away. But for now, I retained ownership while splitting all profits 3 ways between myself, David, and Malcolm. It felt right. It felt like what Mitchell should have done 41 years ago. Mom, there's someone here to see you, David called from the entrance. I turned to see a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. Mrs. Hartwell? I'm Maria Santos. Elena Rodriguez was my sister. My breath caught. Malcolm's mother. She nodded. I heard about what happened, about Malcolm finding his family. I wanted to thank you for welcoming him. Malcolm climbed down from the ladder, wiping his hands on a rag. When he saw Maria, his face lit up. Aunt Maria, what are you doing here? I brought something that belongs to you, she said, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. Your mother asked me to hold on to this until you found your father's family. Malcolm unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a silver locket, tarnished with age. He opened it to reveal 2 tiny photos, one of Elena and one of Mitchell. She wore this every day after you were born, Maria said softly. She said someday you'd want to remember what love looked like. Malcolm's eyes filled with tears. I remember this. She used to let me play with it when I was little. She never stopped believing that your father would come back, Maria continued. Even after she got sick, even when she knew she was dying, she thought maybe someday he'd change his mind. I felt a pang of grief for this woman I'd never met, who'd loved my husband and been abandoned by him. I'm sorry, I said. I'm sorry he hurt her. I'm sorry he wasn't the man he should have been. Maria looked at me with surprising gentleness. You didn't know about us. Elena never blamed you for what happened. I should have known, I said. There were signs. Times when he was distant, when he made excuses. I just didn't want to see them. Elena said he talked about you sometimes, Maria said. Said you were a good woman who deserved better than the lies he was telling. The words hit me unexpectedly hard. Even in his affair, even while abandoning his son, Mitchell had known he was failing me too. Would you like to stay for dinner? I asked suddenly. I'd like to hear more about Elena. Malcolm should know about his mother, Maria smiled. I'd like that very much. That evening we gathered in Malcolm's apartment, which had become our informal family meeting place. Maria brought photo albums full of pictures of Elena and young Malcolm. She told stories about Elena's dreams, her struggles as a single mother, Her fierce love for her son. She was so proud when you got your electrician's license, Maria told Malcolm. She said her boy was going to light up the world. I wish I could have done more for her, Malcolm said quietly. You were everything to her, Maria replied. Even when things were hard, even when she was working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, she never regretted having you. David had been quiet throughout dinner, but finally he spoke up. I keep thinking about all the time we lost. Malcolm and I could have grown up together. We could have been real brothers from the start. You're real brothers now, I said. That's what matters. But Dad robbed us of that, David continued. He robbed Malcolm of a father, robbed me of a brother, robbed Elena of the life she deserved. Yes, he did, I agreed. But we can't change the past. We can only decide what to do with the future. Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket Maria had given him. I want you to have this, he said, offering it to me. Malcolm, no. That was your mother's. And she loved my father, despite everything he did to her, despite everything he took from her. Malcolm's voice was steady but emotional. You've given me something she always wanted for me. A family. A place to belong. I took the locket with trembling hands. Thank you. There's something else, Malcolm said. I've been thinking about changing my name, legally, to Peterson Hartwell. David's eyes widened. Really? I want to honor both my parents, Malcolm explained. My mother, who raised me and sacrificed everything for me, and my father, who I'm finally getting to know through his family. That's beautiful, Maria said, tears in her eyes. Over the following weeks, our new family dynamic continued to evolve. David filed for divorce from Jovi, a process that was complicated by her incarceration but necessary for his emotional healing. Malcolm legally changed his name to Malcolm Peterson Hartwell, and we held a small celebration in the building's courtyard. I started having weekly dinners with both my sons, alternating between Malcolm's apartment and David's house. We were learning each other's habits, preferences, stories. Malcolm told us about his years in foster care, his struggles to find belonging. David shared memories of growing up as an only child, always wishing for a sibling. I used to ask Dad why I didn't have a brother or sister, David confessed one evening. He always said it just wasn't meant to be. In a way, he was right, Malcolm said. It wasn't meant to be the way it happened, but maybe it was meant to be this way, when we were all ready for it. 3 months after Jovi's sentencing, I received an unexpected letter. It was from her, written from prison. Loretta, it began. I know you'll probably throw this away without reading it, but I need to say something. I was wrong. Not just about the money, but about everything. I spent so many years thinking that you didn't deserve what you had, that David deserved more. I convinced myself that I was protecting our family, but I was really just destroying it. I don't expect forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. But I want you to know that seeing David choose you and Malcolm over me, seeing him find the family he always needed, made me realize what I'd become. I turned into someone I don't recognize. Take care of them. Take care of the family you've built. It's real in a way ours never was. I read the letter twice, then folded it and put it away. I wouldn't respond, but I was glad she'd written it. Not for her sake, but for David's. Someday, when he was ready, he might want to know that she'd finally understood what she'd lost. A year later, I stood in the same courthouse where Jovi had been sentenced, but this time for a much happier occasion. Malcolm was officially adopting David's last name as his middle name, becoming Malcolm Peterson Hartwell Barrett. It was unconventional, but it felt right. He was honoring all the families that had shaped him, even the complicated ones. You don't have to do this, David had told him when Malcolm first suggested it. I want to, Malcolm replied. You're my brother. I want that to be official. The judge who performed the ceremony was the same one who'd presided over Jovi's case. She smiled as she signed the papers. It's nice to see this family in my courtroom for something positive, she said. That evening, we celebrated at the building's rooftop garden, which Malcolm had installed as a surprise for my 67th birthday. The tenants had all contributed to the project, and it had become a gathering place for the small community we'd built. Speech, called Mrs. Rodriguez from 4A, who'd become something of a surrogate grandmother to Malcolm. I stood up, looking around at the faces gathered around our table. David and his new girlfriend Sarah, whom he'd met at a support group for people dealing with family trauma. Malcolm and Maria, who'd become a regular fixture at our family dinners. The other tenants, who'd watched our family drama unfold and had chosen to stay and be part of our story. A year ago, I thought I was losing my family. I began. I thought that inheriting this building was a burden, that it had cost me my relationship with my son. I never imagined that it would actually give me a family I never knew I had. I looked at Malcolm, this man who'd started as a stranger, a problem tenant, and had become one of the most important people in my life. Family isn't just about blood or marriage certificates, I continued. It's about choosing each other, day after day. It's about showing up when things get difficult. It's about forgiveness and second chances and the courage to start over. I raised my glass. To the family we found, the family we chose, and the family we're still becoming. As everyone raised their glasses in response, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. Mitchell's secrets had finally been revealed, his debts paid, his wrongs made as right as they could be. Jovi's manipulations had been exposed and stopped. But most importantly, the family that should have existed 41 years ago finally did. It looked different than it would have then, shaped by loss and time and hard-won wisdom, but it was real, and it was ours, and it was worth everything we'd been through to find it. Later that night, as I sat in my apartment looking through old photo albums, I found a picture of Mitchell from early in our marriage. He was young and handsome, full of the promise of the life we'd planned together. I studied his face, trying to reconcile the man I'd loved with the man I'd discovered him to be. I would never fully understand the choices he'd made, the pain he'd caused, the opportunities he'd wasted. But I'd learned something important from his mistakes. Love wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, being honest, and choosing each other even when it was hard. I'd failed at that with Mitchell, but not because I hadn't loved him enough. I'd failed because he'd never given me the chance to love all of him, including the broken parts. But I wouldn't fail with Malcolm and David. They would know they were loved, completely and unconditionally. They would never have to wonder if they belonged. I closed the album and put it away. Some stories end with revenge, some with justice, some with redemption. Ours ended with something simpler and more powerful than any of those. It ended with a family. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.